Hi, I'm Dr Ray Middleton. I'm the Workforce Development Lead at Fulfilling Lives in Newcastle and Gateshead, where we're working hard for a better response for people with complex needs, combining mental health, offending, substance misuse and/or homelessness or accommodation needs. We're talking about those people in our society who often face multiple disadvantage. Unfortunately, in a pandemic, it's the poorest and the most socially disadvantaged that fare the worst. I've been reflecting on the coronavirus outbreak and the different reactions I and the people around me are having to it. The reactions we're having in our patterns of thinking, our emotions, our behaviour, and also in our ways of relating with others. As I've been on my learning curve, I've thought it would help us all to have a trauma-informed approach to how we respond individually and collectively to the coronavirus. So, in the hope of being helpful, I'm going to share some bite-sized, trauma-informed tips on how to respond well to the coronavirus. So, tip number 1 is to acknowledge to ourselves and others that the coronavirus pandemic is a traumatic event. That it's a threat to our physical and psychological safety and well-being, which we're all living through. However, it will disproportionately affect the more vulnerable in our society. It helps to understand trauma as both the traumatic event and the reactions to that event. This is called trauma reactions. Trauma stress reactions are any experience that causes an intense physical and psychological stress reaction, or the lasting effects from harmful or threatening events. Traumatic events can happen to individuals, such as physical, emotional or sexual abuse, but they can also be events that happen to groups of people. And the worldwide coronavirus pandemic is such an example of a trauma that is happening to everybody worldwide. But some smaller subgroups in society are disproportionately affected, such as those who are poorer, the disabled, those losing their jobs and income as a consequence of the government public health measures, or people who are homeless or who have substance misuse or mental health issues. And the organisation SAMHSA defined trauma as a single event, multiple events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically and emotionally harmful or threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's physical, social, emotional or spiritual well-being. The Adverse Childhood Experiences or ACEs studies have shown that people needing mental health, substance misuse and accommodation support have often been exposed to multiple traumatic events in their childhood. Because of these high levels of unresolved trauma, this group of people are at increased vulnerability of being re-traumatized and triggered by the current trauma and adversity that the coronavirus is causing. The ACEs research shows a clear link between high levels of past trauma and the formation of health-harming habits, such as excessive alcohol or drug use, or other addictive patterns, such as self-harming or problematic eating, which are also public health concerns. This insight about the link led to the development of trauma-informed approaches which help to improve the ways we can work with people. So the first trauma-informed coronavirus tip is to see the pandemic and our reactions to it through a trauma-informed lens, where we hold in mind that trauma is both the traumatic event and our varying reactions to that event. This brings us to tip number 2, which is that there's a wide range of diversity and difference in how people react to traumatic experiences. Two people may have very different reactions and responses to a similar traumatic event. People vary widely in how many traumatic events they experience growing up and during adult life. So the ACEs study found 1 in 3 people don't have any adverse childhood experiences, whereas 2 out of 3 people have at least 1. 1 in 10 people have 4 or more, and a smaller group of people have 6 or more ACEs, and on average that group of people would die 20 years younger on average. So there's exceptions, but that's an example of the difference there is in how much adversity and trauma people have experienced. The severity, frequency and types of traumas experienced varies between people. The younger you are experiencing trauma, the number of traumas and the length of time they went on for all make a difference. This may help us to understand the wide variation in how people react to a generally threatening experience like the coronavirus. Some people might talk to someone they trust about how they feel about the threat, whilst other people do not have another person in their life that they feel they can trust or someone they feel safe to confide in. And so people may keep their experience of something that's been threatening or traumatic a secret for weeks, months or years or decades. It's important to remember that often people react to trauma in positive and resilient ways by processing and making sense of the traumatic incident, maybe by talking it through with someone they trust. In this resilient, healthy, positive reaction to trauma, it has no negative ongoing impact on someone's future life experience. However, sometimes people react to trauma in ways that form health-harming habits, such as drinking too much or self-harming. These common reactions to trauma can be seen as understandable ways to cope with or survive a threatening situation, and an attempt to contain overwhelming emotions such as fear or guilt. However, people can get stuck in these health-harming habits which are formed to cope with trauma, even after the traumatic threat has passed, and become caught in a vicious circle of troubled and troubling behaviour. So there's an increased risk of people forming health-harming habits during this pandemic. One way to reduce the build-up of health-harming habits is to take a trauma-informed approach in how we support people and listen to them with compassion, as we help people to process difficulties in a healthy and resilient way and help them to make sense of their experiences, and also how we make sense of the experiences ourselves, because we're all going through this. So the second trauma-informed coronavirus tip is to hold in mind that there is diversity and difference in people's reaction to a traumatic threat, and these differences are likely to connect to the extent to which people's past experiences of unresolved trauma is being triggered by current adversity. This brings us to tip number 3, which is to think about social resilience. People's ability to deal effectively with and process adversity and traumas in life in a healthy, positive way is called resilience. It's helpful to think about resilience in a social way, connected to the social network around someone. That's those people who can help them cope with and make sense of trauma and adversity, and also to help practically with getting food and the things we need to survive and get shelter. So resilience is not just a capacity inside a person. For example, many people explain how they coped with a traumatic situation was by having someone they could trust, listen to them and help them process and make sense of it with compassion. Making use of positive relationships in their social network is the normal way people are resilient and draw on our community. However, not everyone has positive relationships in their life. So our resilience to cope with life's adversities and difficulties is connected to the quality of our social network of relationships. So increasing the positive relationships around ourselves and others in our social network will make it more likely that we can process and navigate the difficulties and adversities we face as we make use of our social networks and the resources and resilience around us. However, a major challenge with the coronavirus pandemic is that the main way to reduce the threat to life is social distancing, which unintentionally reduces people's social resilience by making it harder to connect with and support each other as a community. It might be better to call this public health measure physical distancing instead of social distancing, to encourage people to still connect with others during this difficult time. We need to think about how to reconnect people socially, as people are already trying to do in lots of ways in order to build up our own and other people's social resilience to make sense of and process this experience that the whole world's living through. The more we do this, the less health-harming habits will build up during this time with long-term effects on people and after the virus has gone. So we need to think about how to reconnect people socially, as people are already trying to do in lots of creative ways, in order to build up our social resilience to make sense of and process this traumatic experience that the whole world is living through. The more we do this, the less health-harming habits will build up during this time, which may have long-term effects on people and society after the virus has gone. It's vitally important to be creative in how we build these positive social networks in times of community traumas like this pandemic, because measures taken, such as social distancing, working from home, and job losses, all act to reduce our normal social resilience networks. People with multiple disadvantage in our society, who combine high levels of past trauma with combinations of needs around substance misuse, mental health and housing or homelessness, tend to have less positive social networks around them and less good quality positive relationships in their life even before the pandemic broke out. So it's vitally important we help this group of people connect with positive social networks and relationships in creative ways that keep them with, creative ways, but within the government public health guidance. So the third trauma-informed coronavirus tip is to hold in mind that we are part of someone's social network of resilience when we connect with them. Resilience is the process of coping with and making sense of trauma and adversity in a healthy, positive way that does not leave lasting harmful effects. It helps to think about this process as social resilience, connected to the quality of relationships within someone's social network, and not as a character trait inside a person. This means improving someone's relationships within a positive social network increases their resilience to cope with life's adversities. So this is a hopeful and positive response to the virus. A trauma-informed approach encourages us all to press the pause button and reflect on the impact trauma has on ourselves and others, and say how we might respond better if we held the reality in mind of the impact it has. This is sometimes called the 3 R's as a way to remember this in our busy working days and nights. So we press the pause button and we recognise something about the impact of trauma, like these 3 tips, and then we reflect and think, well, how could I respond better? Or just validate the good ways in which you are responding in light of these knowledge and skills around trauma. So I would encourage us all to press the pause button and reflect on these 3 trauma-informed tips. The first one was to see the pandemic and our reactions to it through a trauma-informed lens, where we understand trauma as both the traumatic event and our varying reactions to that event. The second point or tip was that there is diversity and difference in people's reactions to a traumatic threat, which likely connects to the extent to which people's past experiences of trauma is being triggered by current adversity. And the third tip was to remember that we are part of someone's social network of resilience when we connect with them, as social resilience is connected to the quality of relationships within someone's network, and so improving people's network and social network increases their resilience to cope with life's adversities. Do share any reflections or thoughts you have about these 3 trauma-informed tips, and feel free to share the film with anyone if you think it might help others. Thank you.